Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back in to bring you our 11.1 Raid Healer tier list. Now, keep in mind, this is going to be focused on the Resto World first, since any healer is good enough to get Cutting Edge on. I myself got Cutting Edge way back in the day as a Holy Priest when it was really bad in Warlords of Draenor, so let's not take this too seriously and have some fun. Most of the basis for this tier list is going to be based on the later fights that we've done in the Undermined raid, because a lot of the early encounters probably going to get stomped pretty darn quick. Gallywix was not tested in PTR whatsoever, so we're kind of going off of what might be happening in the dungeon journal, but this could of course change as we see the fight on like normal and heroic when the raid comes out. Our 4 tiers for today are going to be Dominant, which is a spec that could be brought in the Resto World first and stacked. Strong, a spec that is going to be brought, or almost certainly going to be brought. Can see play as some specs that might be reliant on others getting nerfed, certain utility value being needed in the raid group, or certain encounters that are just beneficial to them. And then the buff me tier, where specs I don't think we're going to see in the Resto World first, unless they get some kind of buffs or certain higher specs get nerfed. In our dominant tier, there is only one, and it is Discipline Priest. I'm not kidding when I tell you that the spec is absolutely blasting since the revamp that they received in 11.1. Some of the big highlights for it is that it's easier to take Ultimate Penitence, which can now move as you're sort of flying around the room kind of slowly to be able to deal big damage and also have a good shield on yourself. You also are having Evangelism split up from Lenience. Evangelism is one of your major healing cooldowns, extending the duration of your atonements on the raid. And Lenience gives you baseline 3% damage reduction to anybody in the raid who has atonement on them. Now, Oracle's niche as a hero talent is having long atonement uptimes, which can mean you get even more Lenience value, while Voidweaver also is very, very strong and brings a lot of bursty healing to the equation. The revamps also make it so there's no cooldown reduction tied to smiting for your pet, your squid, your Shadow Covenant, which is your primary damage buff. And since you don't have to be smiting to get the cooldown back, you're less punished by high movement encounters, and the encounters we are seeing in the new raid have kind of like bursts of movement, where you might take a Warlock Gateway really quickly, or you might run for a few seconds, and then you'll be able to plant your feet and start blasting, which is really favorable for Disc. And there's a lot of encounters like the One-Armed Bandit with a lot of consistent damage and negative heal absorbs around every 30 seconds, which is perfect for Disc's ramp profile. Really high movement that could be punishing for Disc is kind of concentrated in like early raid fights, like Styx Bunk Junker or Rick Reverb in particular, where you're kind of running all over the place. But these aren't really the make or break fights of the raid that are determining the compositions. The latter 3 fights we could actually test were not very punishing at all for the movement of a Disc Priest, and a lot of things you could actually be playing around to be successful. So you have excellent output, crazy damage mitigation for the incoming raid. The movement on the encounters is not so punishing that you can't set up for your healing, and the revamps have made it easier for you to set up that healing moment when you have to do a lot of movement. So in all, Discipline looks insanely dominant going into the Undermined raid, and there's a possibility, I think, that you could stack it on a couple of key encounters. On our strong tier, we'll start off with Mistweaver Monk, as they've been absolutely blasting throughout a large portion of our raid testing experience. And a lot of the changes that they received in 11.1 didn't really target most of the common builds that they were playing in a raid environment to begin with. There recently were some nerfs to more of the mastery that was getting pushed as like a heavy mastery build in raids with the Chi-Ji Celestial instead of Yu'lon. And all the nerfs were like really focused on trying to kill that off and further encourage the Rising Wind Kick, steady, renewing mist healing, amping that up with more Rising Wind Kicks or Rushing Wind Kicks, and then using Yu'lon as your sort of ramp tool. While they're not as insanely rampy as they were in like Amirjasil, for example, they can still crank high output when the moment arises for them. And they also have a really nice steady healing curve, so when a Disc Priest is not ramping, they still have high consistency for any ticking damage the raid might have. Mistweaver features really excellent personal survivability, which is absolutely key in a world-first environment, and their movement and also how they heal is really beneficial for the incoming raid. They are able to have their Rushing Wind Kick hit a target of up to like 20 yards away or something along those lines, so even if they get pushed out of melee by a mechanic for a sec, They can either get back into it very quickly with Roll, Transcend, Lighter Than Air, Tiger's Lust, the wealth of mobility they bring to the table, but they can also hit their kicks from a distance and then get back into melee as mechanics are going to allow for them. So they're not really getting punished at all by any incoming movement, and their steady healing profile is really synergistic with what Discipline brings to the table. And we don't know for sure what tanks are going to be brought, but if Mistweaver's already successful, then you can bring your physical vulnerability there in the raid, and then other specs like Prot Paladin or Blood DK could be more prominently featured in the raid. Joining Mistweaver on the strong tier is Holy Priest. Now their revamp was really, they said, focused on getting Perv Healing and Renew into a good spot, and it didn't really work, but what did work was making your holy words very powerful once again. Notably, Sanctify, your AoE heal, has been really weak in Nerebar Palace, and the revamp has brought a lot of strength to it and increased range to it, and Renew kind of is worth casting if you take the Empowered Renew talent, which places a 12-second cooldown on it, but gives bonus cooldown reduction to your Sanctify, so you can kind of feed into your holy words more. The rest of the revamp for Holy Priest put a lot of strength into Apotheosis. While they slightly nerfed the cooldown reduction that it gives you, your uptime is tremendously higher thanks to some of the new talents extending the duration of your Apotheosis by casting more Holy Words. So you have more ways to get Holy Word cooldown reduction, like the Empowered Renew. You also have the Divine Hymn revamp, which makes it do the same healing, but channel faster, and have supporting talents, which cast more Prayer of Mendings onto the raid, which, with the Answered Prayers talent, can give you more Apotheosis uptime from casting Divine Hymn. Archon's Halo hero talent already gives you more healing when you're inside your Apotheosis window, so that's even more incentive for you to be blasting huge amounts of healing. So your AoE Holy Words are more powerful, your single target Holy Words already were really good, and now you get more cooldown reduction for them, so your spot healing roll is still in place, and you just get more consistent high output from it as well, so you're constantly evening out the health pools for the consistent AoE healers. And you bring Symbol on top of it, which can give you some good damage reduction. And on top of that, you get a lot of Surge procs, giving you instant cast flash heals from your Halos, which, when you're running the Archon hero talent, also gives you Sanctify cooldown reduction. So you get more instant cast Holy Words that are hitting harder, that you're more consistently getting, and you're also extending the duration of your Apotheosis, which all together means that you're doing really good spot healing. You're able to heal on the move more consistently and more easily because of all the extra instant cast that you have bringing into it. And on top of that, if the double disc does come to fruition, you can very easily swap specs into that and support your raid from that angle as well. You're only gearing one character, and you can be very flexible with how you are healing the group and what you're bringing to the table as well. Holy Priest is very powerful on its own, and it gets even better when it also has the option in a world first environment to quickly spec over to disc for some very favorable encounters. Most of Resto Druid's changes in 11.1 were more focused on the class tree getting revamped and then cleaning up a couple of things on the spec side. One of which was making sure that your mastery is actually doing more healing at lower hot counts, since the more hots you had, the more healing you would do. And they kind of needed to smooth out that equation a little bit so that your healing, when you only had 1 or 2 hots on players, wasn't super insanely low. So that aspect helps a little bit in a raiding environment because you can actually do some decent spot healing when you needed to. But what our Druid really brings to the table is a smoother healing profile with strong ramps that can be very synergistic to a Disc Priest. That being said, I kind of have them in the Kensi play because they didn't seem as dominant or super powerful as some of the other healers above them, and it looks like DPS Druids are going to be pretty good in the next raid, so you don't need to have a Resto Druid for Mark of the Wild, but they could be a candidate for filling in that buff. Just like Divine Hymn for Holy Priest, Tranquility is now going to be channeling faster, so you're going to be able to be less punished by any sort of potential movement mechanics in the raid, and our Druid already has the instant casts and a lot of movement abilities to get to where they need to be when they need to be there, making it very easy to overcome some movement challenges that this incoming raid might bring to them. I very much see them as kind of like on the bubble, that if anything above them gets nerfed or something like that, they'll be immediate beneficiaries, or if some new build comes along or they get buffed, then they could immediately kind of get into the Race to World First consistently for teams from what they bring to the table. Preservation Evoker was like the god of Nerebar Palace world first progression, and it never got nerfed until after the race was over, and it actually was kind of eating Disc Priest's lunch since it had a very similar ramp type profile. Now the 11.1 changes have been working to kind of like smooth it out so that it's not just Consumed Flame carrying everything for the spec like it was at the beginning of Nerebar Palace. They even made it so that your tier set bonus with the insurance buffs can be procced by echoing Verdant Embraces, giving you a bit more output in some different areas that's not only in the hero talents. Preservation really was able to shine for stacked burst healing, and you really noticed it a lot on encounters like Kaiveza, where you would just basically only have the Preservation Evoker using their engulfs to consume Dream Breath and extend its duration and pop for huge amounts of healing with the Consumed Flame heal effect. And while it still brings that to the table, and there's a lot of stacked fights in the new raid that Prez can benefit from, they're not doing stupid OP levels of healing anymore. Discipline is actually much easier to play when you don't have to be smiting for cooldown reduction. The fights are a little bit less punishing on the movement equation from what we've seen at a Nerebar Palace. And Discipline is bringing a lot more mitigation than Preservation is, with Barrier, Lenience, and all these other effects. And so Prez is in a good position, and certainly if you needed to have another Time Spiral or something along those lines, or some other specs started getting nerfed, you could absolutely see it played in the Race to World First. But I think it's also kind of on this bubble level, or almost preying on other healers' downfall to get it into that consistent Race to World First representation. Next up, we've got the buff me tier. This is going to include some specs, which I think we all know about, that need a little bit of extra love in one way or another. Resto Shaman, their revamps in 11.1 were very basic. They replaced Primordial Wave, the Shadowlands talent, and replaced it with a new one called Whispering Waves, which is entirely passive. And basically, with the Riptides you have out, they're going to proc additional heals on your allies when you heal with Healing Wave. So you cast Healing Wave on Bob, and everybody else in the raid who has Riptide also gets a heal. Kind of nice, very good for any rot healing encounters or attrition style healing encounters, but we don't really have those anymore. If this was brought in like early BFA onto like a Gahoon type encounter where there's constant damage and nobody's ever topped off, that'd be great. If there are more opportunities for Resto Shaman's Mastery to have consistent effect when players are consistently low health for long periods of time, that would be great. But we don't really live in that world anymore, and we haven't for a while, so a lot of these 11.1 changes weren't too helpful in helping the spec find a way. Now Ancestral Guidance was removed, and the spec received like a 3% overall HPS buff to kind of compensate for it, but the spec doesn't really have this super valuable healing profile to the table. They used to be all about stacked healing, and then as they made it so that Chain Heal could bounce further, they kind of found their niche in like spread healing, and that's where they were heavily featured on Nexus Princess Kaiveza, because you had an intermission where people were spread out to the four winds, and a shaman with Ascendance could do crazy amounts of healing to everybody and keep them alive. Now we don't really have encounters like that, and we have a lot of encounters where players can stack, which could be good for Spirit Link, but it could also be just as good for Barrier, especially if the Disc Priest is doing more overall healing by a pretty significant margin from what we've seen on PTR thus far. And so there's not really any pure rot fights, there's not really a lot of spread fights. Maybe there would be on Gallywix, but we haven't seen it yet. And the spec just kind of feels lost as a result. There's not a niche that they're able to operate really well in, and their mastery doesn't really benefit from the world we live in, the overall healing profiles we actually encounter in the incoming raids. And so you're kind of preying on the downfall or preying on some buffs for the spec to kind of bring it back up to a level that it can be more competitive with others. Now notably, the spec did get some buffs to Farseer, and it's something that's consistently been receiving buffs over time to try to rejuvenate it and make it feel a little bit better. But even when you're operating it properly, you're not bringing like the burst that a Preservation Evoker or Disc Priest is bringing to the table. You're not really doing certain things better than others to make it so that you're so desirable in that niche. A lot of like overall healing is all about comparative advantages. Somebody who's really good at ramp healing is going to do that and continue doing that. The other healers, like a Mistweaver, they can bring steadier healing and constant healing and also ramp, are a good complement for that. Holy Priest to bring the spot healing and single target healing and constantly be focusing on that is a really good beneficiary. But Shaman feels like it's kind of lost its niche to others, and it feels like it's kind of punished in terms of its overall HPS, at least at the moment. And lastly, and unfortunately, that's going to bring us to Holy Paladin, right there next to Resto Shaman in the buff me tier. The revamps in 11.1, I guess we're kind of filling out the rest of the spec and making it so that inflorescence of the Sunwell, or infusion of light procs, I should say, we're actually having a purpose once you've already casted your judgment. They made the greater judgment absorb effect a little weaker, try to redistribute some strength into other areas with your spenders, make Holy Light an actual mana burn, and overall the spec's still pretty weak. It's weak in overall output and raid testing, it's been weak in dungeon testing as well, and the way that they have organized the power and the hero talents has also been a pretty big problem. Herald of the Sun was really strong at the beginning of Nerebar Palace, but again, going back to our conversation about comparative advantages, a lot of the strength of Herald was actually in the stacked healing. If you could have everybody stacked, you'd have wings up, the beams would radiate from your Paladin, look awesome, heal allies that are being touched by it. Wonderful. But it's not better than other healers for stacked healing. And when it came to spread healing, there were also better options out there too. Lightsmith comes along and starts doing great healing with Avenging Crusader, and now it is getting more nerfs as well, ironically, to some of the stacked healing that you see out of things like Hammer and Anvil getting nerfed, Blessed Assurance getting nerfed, where your Crusader strikes are not hitting as hard after a spender. So you're having other things cutting down on the power of Avenging Crusader, cutting down on the power of stacked healing. There's not a lot of spread healing in the raid, and so what are you really kind of left with for the spec? You get really good single target healing out of the Holy Lights, but they cost a crazy amount of mana, and you have to worry about managing that. Whereas other healers, they, have to think about their mana a little bit, but not nearly to the same degree as Holy Paladin currently does. Where this leaves us is that Paladin is kind of just a shell of itself. It does not do good single target healing. It doesn't really do good AoE healing. The Avenging Crusader healing is fine, but it's kind of just spread out all over the place with like the semi-smart healing it has, so you can't really focus output into targets when you need to, but you also can't ramp like a Disc Priest or Preservation Evoker and push everybody's health bars up together. It feels like you're really punished for having Devotion Aura in the raid, to be frank with you, but at the same time, you have Disc Priests who could just bring Barrier or Lenience or other mitigation tools and still do much better output on top of it. And so oddly enough, Paladin, which was once this like lock into raid progression, feels like it just constantly gets pushed down and punished in both raids and Mythic Plus. And while it'll be fine for groups, and many teams are used to bringing Paladin players as just a constant in high-end raid progression, it really kind of seems like it's going the other direction for Holy Paladin, unless they start receiving some major buffs very soon. Keep in mind, other Paladin specs can have Devo Aura be brought to the table for the 3% DR, and while nobody else would have access to Aura Mastery to give you the 12-20% additional damage reduction for the entire raid, that's not the biggest of deals, because most of the big damage on the last 3 encounters we could test, you could stack for most of the time. So you could be in a Barrier, you could be in a Darkness, AMZ, you could be in these other mitigation tools that exist and will be brought to the raid anyway, and so you're not going to be missing Devo Aura as much. I'd also point to Kaiveza, where they benched the Paladin in the World First Kill. Even though the Devo Aura was really helpful in the intermission phase, it only lasted like 6 seconds, and so it could mitigate a lot of damage, but the overall HPS of the spec wasn't enough to make up for it in that aspect. And its other niches, or healing profiles, weren't really enough to help it in stacked healing or spread healing either. And so the spec still really feels quite lost in terms of what Blizzard wants from it and what they're going to be strong at. Because at the moment, I don't really see a lot of those strengths, unfortunately. So this, I think, is where we stand going into the Race to World first, and what I would expect to see represented fairly prominently. Things can always change, as we know and as we've experienced in the past, but at the moment, I do think you're very much going to see a world with Disc Priests being brought, if not 2 of them on a couple of key encounters, lots of Mistweavers, and lots of Holy Priests. Let me know what you guys think, and if there was anything else I missed. Huge love to our patrons for making all this content possible. If you'd like to join, check it out in the description down below. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.